In a world where high-speed steeling Hello Internet, my name is Quinn and this is Blondihacks. If you're interested in setting up a hobby machine shop, you're probably mostly thinking about which lathe is the best, or how big of a mill can I squeeze into my husband's sewing room before he notices? Important life questions like that. What you may not be thinking about though is all of the other power tools that are required to support those machine tools. Machine tools are the stars of the show, but they're kind of like battleships. They need all the little ships around them to refill the bunker oil and do the laundry to keep going. So I'm going to talk about all those other tools that you should be planning to buy if you're interested in home shop machining. So let's go. Let's start here with the bandsaw. If you've only got the money or the space for one other power tool in addition to your machine tools, I think the bandsaw is a no-brainer. You need some kind of saw to go with your machine tools, and these little portable bandsaws that you can get now are, I think, a revolution in terms of utility per cubic centimeter that they take up in your shop. These things are so incredibly useful. I always say that the fastest machine tool in the shop is the bandsaw. All machining is subtractive manufacturing. You're removing material, and nothing removes material faster than a saw. And this is especially important in a hobby shop, because if you don't have a Bridgeport or a K&T or some other beast of a machine tool, you can't necessarily take a giant block of stock and hew your part from it as if removing everything from a block of marble that doesn't look like an elephant. I mean, you can do that, but you're going to be here for weeks because these hobby machines can only take light cuts. Essentially, on the scale of industrial machining, with a hobby machine, every cut is a finishing cut. And that's really the way to think about it. So what you're doing with a bandsaw is you're roughing in all of your machining operations, just getting very close to dimension with something like a bandsaw, and then using the hobby mill or the hobby lathe to just finish those surfaces up. Just do that last little bit to make it a machined part. Once you start thinking about hobby machining in that way, you're going to get a lot more done a whole lot faster and burn up a lot fewer cutters and a lot fewer cheap import spindle bearings. You can see I've got mine set up with a little homemade table here, and I strongly recommend this. This was an idea that I definitely had, and I was definitely not badgered into making it by 50,000 viewers over the course of multiple years, and I'm super glad I had this idea, because setting up a bandsaw in a vertical orientation like this really is transformative. This gives you the precision and the control to really get close to your final machining dimensions with the saw. And you can still use it for the normal horizontal or freehand use case where you're just chopping big chunks of stock apart. These saws have one more secret weapon that doesn't get enough attention, especially for hobbyists. Changing the blades on them is super fast. It's just one big lever back here to release the tension, swap out the blade, crank that lever down, and you're done. So it's really easy to have different blades that have different purposes in your shop. So in my case, I've got a 14 TPI blade here for cutting through thick stock, and this blade is a beast. It goes very quickly. And then I've also got a 24 TPI blade for sheet metal, which is really great. If you don't have sheet metal tools like shears and brakes and so on, a 24 TPI blade on a portaband can do a lot of that work. Now, if you have the space, another option to consider is the horizontal bandsaw. These 4x6 horizontal bandsaws are ubiquitous. They come in all the colors. I don't think it matters which one you buy. I happen to own the green one, but as far as I know, they're all identical. If you have the space, the value, again, per dollar on these is pretty remarkable. These things can do some real work. Where they really shine is if you're doing fabrication projects, like if you want to build some metal shelves or a steel workbench, something like that, where you have to cut a lot of different parts, maybe with different miter angles, and you've got a lot of heavy stock to manipulate. This thing will save you so much effort. Honestly, if you're going to build a steel workbench, let's say, this thing will pay for itself with that single project. Now, even if you're not into fabrication, if you're doing machining projects with larger stock, like let's say a 6-inch diameter piece of round bar, even if it's aluminum, cutting that with even the portaband is a big job, and that's going to be too big to part off on a hobby lathe. So something like this guy might be the only way you have to make a cut like that. And metallic ore save the person who tries to do that with a hacksaw. So again, if you have the space and you think you might do even a couple of projects with 4, 5, 6-inch diameter stock, this thing is going to pay for itself with a single cut. And the great thing about these is the auto shut off. After the cut, it shuts itself off. So you can set up a long cut like that and go do other things. Now, I wouldn't leave any power tool completely unattended, but you can at least be standing nearby and working on something while that cut runs. And that's a huge efficiency bonus, even in a hobby shop. So if you have the space, definitely consider one of these. And as you probably know, these saws can also be used in the vertical orientation as a vertical bandsaw. However, they come with this sheet metal table for the purpose, which is absolute 100% complete unadulterated garbage. So if you're buying one of these saws with the intent of using it in the vertical orientation a lot, one of the very first things you should do is make yourself a better table, because these things are just unusably bad. And I will say, having used these saws in the vertical orientation a lot and also used the Portaband vertically quite a lot, the Portaband is by far the better choice for general vertical bandsaw use. These blades don't run very fast, even with the belt set on the highest speed, because when you're using it horizontally, they don't need to run that fast, and you don't want them running too fast for long cuts without coolant. So the blade is just too slow. When you're pushing stock through by hand in a vertical setup, you really want more blade speed than these saws will do. And the blade guides are, very far away, so you don't get a lot of blade support, and so the blades on these really wander when you're doing vertical cuts. So there's a lot of compromises here. It's nice that the option exists at all if you have no other way to do a vertical bandsaw setup. This is an option, and I used it this way a fair bit before I got the Portaband, and in a pinch it does work, but definitely not ideal. Next up is the drill press, or pillar drill as my Commonwealth compatriots might say. It's a close race as to whether this or the bandsaw is a better companion to your small machine tools. If at all possible, I think you got to do both, because much like how the bandsaw saves you immense amounts of time and can do things that your small machine tools will never be able to do, the drill press is the same thing. You might be tempted to think you can just use your mill as a drill press, and if you have a Bridgeport, that's probably true. But if you have a tiny benchtop hobby milling machine, that is definitely not true. You are not going to be able to drill big holes on large pieces with one of those machines, and there are frequently times when you need to do that. The other key to the drill press is that it's one of the easiest ways to get a machine tool of a form with a lot of vertical space. That's the primary limitation of small machine tools, is the working envelope of them. And a cheap floor standing drill press like this, or even a benchtop machine, has a lot more vertical real estate than even the best benchtop hobby milling machine does. And what that means is, in a pinch, you can work on tall parts and use reamers and other long pieces of tooling in a drill press where you wouldn't be able to on your milling machine. This drill press has gotten me out of a lot of binds. I've frequently gotten deep into a project on my little milling machine, run out of vertical space at a critical moment, and been saved by having the ability to transfer that work over here to the drill press and finish it up. The other thing that this gives you is easy access to horsepower. Small milling machines can't do great big holes in heavy steel, for example. If you're doing a project where you need to drill a whole bunch of 1-inch holes in steel, or even half-inch holes in steel, you just can't do it on a small milling machine without getting out the boring bar and being there all day. Whereas even a humble weekend warrior grade drill press like this thing can power through big blocks of steel with a half-inch drill all day, no problem. And of course, if you do any amount of, dare I say it, woodworking, the drill press is going to pay for itself very quickly there as well. Quick sidebar on drill presses: if you're coming into hobby machining from woodworking or home DIY types of experience, the number one mistake that I see those people do when they come into metalworking is they run their drills too fast. If you're new to metalworking, you've probably never heard of surface speed and never looked up a chart for surface speed for different metals for different sizes of drills. If you did, you might be surprised at how slow you should be running large drills. In wood, I guess it doesn't really matter. Run them as fast as you want and they cut just fine. When you run a drill too fast in metal, it's actually going to cut slower because the chip action on those cutting edges isn't correct, and you're going to burn up those drills, wear them out very quickly, make a bunch of heat, make a bunch of smoke. It's a mess. So learn how to read surface speed charts for drills if you're going to get into metalworking from one of those other disciplines, because bet you anything you're running your drills too fast. But I'm glad I had that little rant just now, because one of the key superpowers of the drill press is that you can run them slowly. you can get spindle speeds very low on, once again, even a basic drill press like this, and still have tons and tons of torque. The problem with small milling machines is often that you can't run the spindles very slow. They're DC powered, they lose all their torque at low RPM, and so that once again is a big limiting factor on how big of tooling you can run in that spindle. Whereas this drill press, I can slow it way down. I think the lowest speed on this thing is 100 RPM, and it's still got enough torque to break your arm. So that's really what you need if you're drilling, say, big drills in steel. And remember that we call them drill presses for a reason. It is a press, and that's also important for those big drills. Again, woodworkers and DIYers, pay attention. When you're using a big drill, they require a lot of downforce to keep the chip action correct in that steel. And that's why these things have big, heavy spindles on them. It's so you can press those drills through the material. That's another rookie mistake that you see a lot for people new to metalworking, is they're running the drill too fast, but they're also not pushing down hard enough. Once you learn how much you're really supposed to be leaning on this quill, suddenly, like magic, your drills will start cutting beautifully and you'll make holes very quickly, even in heavy steel. Remember, you can't say drill press without press. Now let's talk bench grinders. I've hesitated to wait this long in the video to talk about these because I'm really torn as to whether you can live without one of these or not in a hobby shop. In a world where high-speed steel tooling was the best and only option, then yeah, obviously the bench grinder is a critical piece of machinery. You can't make tooling for any of your machine tools without one. However, we live in a world where carbide insert tooling is relatively affordable and plentiful, even for the hobbyist. So could you survive for a while without a bench grinder? Sure, you could. I think you're definitely going to need one sooner or later though. So maybe it's not a day one purchase, but it's definitely going to be a pretty early purchase in your hobby machine shop. And of course, bench grinders have all sorts of other utility for metalworking. You can run Scotch-Brite wheels on them and buffing wheels, steel brushes, lots of different types of metalworking tools. And they're great for prepping the ends of stock for welding, things like that. I think a basic Weekend Warrior big box store grade bench grinder like this is perfectly fine for hobby machine shops up to, let's say, 1/2-inch square tooling. Once you get above that, grinding on these little low horsepower bench grinders gets so slow and so tedious that you can't do it. You're going to be there all day just trying to grind a single 1-inch lathe tool on a grinder like this. So if you get into A-bomb size tooling, you're going to need a proper industrial grinder, something like a Baldor or something like that. And if you're getting that serious, then you may want to look into a carbide grinder as well. You don't want to be trying to grind carbide with aluminum oxide wheels like this. The secret to a lot of these Weekend Warrior grade tools is that you're buying the motor. Everything that comes with it is garbage. The dressing tool is going to be terrible. The grinding wheels that come with it are terrible. The tool rests are terrible. So they're so cheap because you're basically paying for the motor, and everything else you should plan on throwing away or upgrading. So I've got Norton grinding wheels on here. I like them a lot. This is a shop-made tool rest that's a bajillion times better than the factory one. I had to go and buy a better dressing tool even because the one that came with it wore out in 18 seconds. Just keep that in mind. You're just buying a motor. Everything else you're going to have to replace. Let's talk torches. I think these are in line with bench grinders in terms of things you don't need on day one, but you're probably going to want pretty soon, and the utility for the amount of space that a simple torch takes up is very high. With even a basic torch setup like this, all of a sudden you can heat treat, you can heat bend, you can heat straighten, you can silver solder, you can even do some light gas welding, things like that. So this really unlocks a lot of power in the metalworking sphere. In a system like this is a basic oxyacetylene setup from Victor, is very affordable, takes up very little space, and for those times when you really need that finger of God heat, this thing is awesome. So you buy it like this, but without the tanks. These sad beat up old tanks are from my local gas supplier. And the tanks are expensive the first time you buy them, but then after that, you just take them in and exchange them. It costs a lot less. So it comes with the regulators and some basic brazing tips and so on. Important safety note though, on a system this small, you're not going to be able to do big, long heating jobs with big rosebud tips and things like that. So if you're looking to, say, braise cast iron or something like that, this is not going to be the setup for that. And the reason is simple. It's the size of the acetylene tank. There's an important safety rule with acetylene called the 1/10 rule. We used to say the 1/7 rule. Now it's the 1/10, a little more conservative. You can't have any kind of setup that's drawing down more than 1/10 of the remaining capacity of the tank per hour. And that's actually a pretty steep limit, steeper than you might think until you start doing the math on the flow rate of the torch and how little acetylene is really in here. The reason for that is that acetylene tanks have liquid acetone in the bottom of them as a stabilizer, keeps that acetylene from going boom in the night. And if you draw down that acetylene too fast, you start drawing the acetone out of the bottom of the tank, reducing the amount of acetone in the tank, making the acetylene less stable. Unstable acetylene is not something you want in your life. Very important. So really you want to limit yourself to the small brazing tips for localized heating, for small silver soldering jobs, small heat straightening jobs, basic heat treating, that sort of thing. But what's great about a torch is that it gives you all of those same powers that something like a heat treat oven would give you, but with a lot less space and a lot less cost. Now, speaking of cost though, acetylene is expensive. So if you're thinking about getting into torches, give serious thought to a basic propane setup like this. This is the Sievert, much loved by model boiler makers. What's great about these is that they hook up to any old hardware store barbecue propane tank, and they make almost as much heat as the acetylene does. You really don't need oxygen in the mix to make way more than enough heat for most hobby torch jobs. And propane is cheap like borscht, so you're going to get a lot more utility for your dollar out of a basic propane torch than you will with the acetylene. The only thing is the propane doesn't give you quite the laser-focused control of heat that an acetylene brazing tip does. So if you're working on really small parts, or you want to heat straighten shafts, things like that, where you really need that sharp control, acetylene is going to be the way to go. But for heat treating and silver soldering and other things where you don't need that kind of precision, these things are really amazing value. And these are actually roofing torches. They're designed for, melting the tar on roofing jobs. But you can get them with all different sizes of tips. This is one of the larger tips, but you can get them smaller than that. You can get smaller torches as well. So take a look at propane. Don't feel like you need oxygen, not even oxypropane or oxyacetylene, basic propane. You might be surprised how much heat these things can really make. What's that? You haven't run out of space yet? Well, we can fix that problem. Let's talk about some of the secondary nice-to-haves for the hobby machine shop. First up is the humble wire feed MIG welder. If you're mainly focused on hobby machining and not so much on fabrication, then a basic welder like this is going to serve you super well. For those handful of times when you need to build some metal shelves or weld a couple of pieces of steel together prior to a machining step, a basic wire feed MIG like this is going to do you very, very well. And I know flux core takes a lot of crap from real welders, but honestly, it's a great tool for hobbyists. You don't need the big gas tanks. You don't have to have an account with the local welding gas supplier and go get those tanks exchanged all the time. You don't have to have a truck to carry those tanks around. So even though flux core is not as nice as proper gas shielded forms of welding are, for those few times you need to build a couple of shelves or slap some scraps together to machine them, flux core is great, and I think people should cut it a lot more slack than they do. Again, for the cubic centimeters per utility of a flux core welder, it's hard to beat it. And then later you can upgrade to gas if you want to with a machine like this. So start with flux core, and if your welding needs expand, you can always add the tanks later. Okay, definitely getting exotic here now, but one other thing to consider when you kind of get to that next level of hobby machining is a D-bit grinder. This is essentially the most basic form of tool and cutter grinder, and there's not much you can't do with it with a little creativity as far as creating and maintaining tooling with one of these. You can grind just about any lathe tool you might ever need. You can regrind end mills in kind of a basic form, not necessarily the spiral flutes, but you can definitely regrind the ends of them to rejuvenate them. So there's a lot that you can do with one of these with some creativity. If you are interested in what these machines are capable of, you definitely want to spend some time watching Stefan Gottsfinter's videos, because he's a longtime user of these and got very creative with what you can do with them. There are now pretty decent import clones of these. This is a Coolman from the 80s. I think Deckel kind of invented the format, but the import ones are apparently quite good. They are a little expensive. I happened into this one for free if I was willing and able to rebuild it, and I was on both counts, so here it is. And I don't use it as much as I would like because I can't use it here this close to the lathe, and I have to move it, and it's very heavy if I want to use it. But someday when I have more space and it's going to be permanently set up, this thing is going to get a lot more use. The reason you might want to consider this once you've had some experience with home shop machining and grinding your own tooling with a basic bench grinder is that this thing will give you that next level of control. When you want to make the perfect threading tool or the perfect O-ring grooving tool for a very specific situation, this is the machine that can do it. Every rake and clearance angle on any type of tool that you might ever want to grind for your lathe or your flat cutter or similar applications with this tool, you can make it perfect with pretty minimal effort. Now there is a steep learning curve on this machine. There's a lot to learn about how to set these up. I've done a series of videos on using these, and in those videos I linked to other people's videos. They're also worth watching. There's a real learning curve with this machine, so go into it with that in mind. I've been using this one off and on for a couple of years now, and I still am a total rookie with it. But if you can invest the time and effort to get good with it, this machine is very capable. But again, it's really hard to make the case that any hobby machinist needs one of these. With a little bit of practice on the bench grinder and a good tool rest, you can grind tools plenty good enough for any model engine building projects or anything like that that you're going to build in a hobby machine shop. So this is definitely a luxury toy if you want to get a peek into the world of real tool and cutter grinders. Similarly, you may have noticed I haven't said the words surface grinder yet in this video. If you have the space in the budget for one of those machines, great, go do it. They are incredible. They'll let you make all your own tooling. You can make your own parallels and 1, 2, 3 blocks, and you can really get into hardening parts and then grinding them to dimension and so on. But those machines are big and they're expensive and are going to be out of the reach of most hobbyists. And frankly, your average hobbyist really doesn't need one. That's my little spiel on all the support tools for a home machine shop. I hope something in there was useful. Thanks for your support. Thanks for watching. Thanks especially to my patrons who make all this possible. And I'll see you next time.